Hi, I'm Mateusz from BoardGameColors, and today we're gonna paint a vault that survived a nuclear apocalypse. Even though epidemics and lockdowns postponed many different conventions, I decided to do something to lift my spirit and prepare for one of them. I'm talking about the Kontrast convention in Warsaw, where hobbyists and professional painters will paint the same figure, Mirko and Brego from Vakliria Miniatures. Link to their site here. And man, how much I like this sculpt. You can interpret it in many different ways, but I see a post-apo survivor with his best friend. His equipment is Soviet, but I don't feel this like a sad stalker or metro vibe. For me, Mirko and Brego are going to an adventure, so American post-apo like Fallout suits them more in my imagination. Because of COVID, I'm not sure when I will be able to paint them, but at least I can prepare a little diorama, or more precisely vignette. So, without further ado, let me show you how I built Vault 84. Okay, so the boy is probably a scavenger, so I feel it's only fitting to me to become a scavenger myself. To build this diorama, I'll use only stuff I found all around. But first thing first, I looked for some inspiration over the internet and I decided to start with this screenshot. Now to build this gear-shaped gate, I need to decide its size. I know that Mirko is in an 80mm scale, so I think that about a 100mm diameter will be fine. I drew and cut a gear template. Then I scavenged a food box that I didn't like and broke it into pieces. I cut the shape of template on one of the walls with a scalpel, scissors and a multi-tool knife. I drilled a hole in the center so I could use a hole saw to cut out a bigger circle. Then I evened the edges with a scalpel. I used a deodorant cap to make a central plate of the gate and a GW gaming base to lift it up a little. To make a star-shaped lock, I used laundry clips, or at least some parts of those. I glued all the parts together and to another piece of container with a superglue, so I can still modify it in further steps. I felt that the gate needs some more mechanisms, so I broke an old clock and scavenged some parts. To fit them, I removed a star-shaped lock and cut some additional grooves in its rear to fit the gears. I glued all the stuff in place, but I felt the other side of the gate is kind of empty, so I cut a rack bars from the wall plugs and glued them in. Okay, now the wall. I already knew that cutting the shape of the gear will be a hard task to do, so I used a material that I find to be one of the easiest to work with, balsa wood. I drew the shape of the gate and started cutting the general shape of the wall with the multi-tool saw and the gate shapes with a scalpel. And it started breaking really quickly. I decided to fix it later with glue and proceeded with the rest of the shape. When it was ready, I checked if it fits with the gate and corrected some minor mistakes. After that, I glued a gear to a plastic sheet scavenged from a shoebox with a superglue, and then all the balsa parts with a wood glue. I also found some leftover shelf holders that kind of looks like a decontamination mechanism housing or something like that, and I glued them all around the gate with a wood glue. I also felt that the wall is still a little empty, so I looked for some more workshop leftovers. I found this screw cover and thought it will be a nice wall lamp. I also bent some 0.5mm aluminium wire with pliers and glued all of them to the wall. For a base I used cork pot washer, probably the most versatile basing material in my kitchen. I cut it to the size with scalpel, remembering to leave a little slot for a lower part of the vault door. I also used some leftover parts as a doorstep. I felt there should be some kind of the walkway, so I cut a rectangle shape from a sanding mesh, removed some of the cork and glued it in. I just need to remember not to use a fine brush to paint it. I cut some pegs from the pins with pliers and glued them to the base of the wall. They will help to hold a wall in place with much stronger bonds. I picked 2 pieces of oak bark I found in a nearby park after a storm. They will make great rocks later on. I glued them and a wall to the base with wood glue. I felt there is still too much flat space, so I also added a smaller piece of bark. Now I'll show you my little secret. Do you know any products that imitate mud? Like Citadel Stirland mud or Vallejo thick mud? They are really convenient, but I always had a problem with their pricing. So I made my own mixture. I bought the cheapest structural paste for decoupage I could find, and for this project I mixed it with wood glue, about 1:1. The pure paste is too thick and doesn't really stick to the surface, but the glue solves the problem. I spread it all around the base, taking special care with all the flat areas and crevices. To finish up this stage I painted over the balsa wood with a polyurethane matte varnish, so the surface is harder and won't absorb too much paint. I let all this stuff dry overnight. Next day I base coated it with dark grey and white paints in a way that will result in zenithal pre-shading. It will make detail more readable to me and also help to create a little color gradient later on. I really enjoy the effect of this step. It always amazes me how this little paint changes the looks of what you build. And it's also a good moment to do some cleaning with a scalpel. Okay, let's start painting. For this step I'm using an old synthetic brush that doesn't hold its tip anymore, because I want to paint a really chaotic texture here. I start with Citadel Troll Slayer Orange. I simply stamp the gate with the brush, just making sure that it's not fully loaded. I use a paper towel if needed. You can see I'm leaving some patches of white. It's intentional. In a moment I will use other colors and it will help to create a nice color gradient. I repeat this step with Citadel Zamesi Desert, again making sure not to cover all the areas. Finally, I follow up with Kimera Colors Cold Yellow. The trick in this method is to paint all the layers one after another, so the paint is not fully cured, and thus moisture from the applied layer will activate a layer below and help to mix them together. Now it's time for a first wash. I'm using Daler&Rowney Sepia ink, adding a few drops of Vallejo glazing medium and a lot of water, about the same amount as ink. I'm washing heavily on all the metallic parts. Now you can probably see the reason why I'm using such a strong bright colors for the first steps. I knew I will dull them down a lot with washes. When a first layer is evenly distributed, I add another one, even heavier than the previous. I want it to stay wet for a few minutes. Quickly I follow by adding some ScaleColor Intensity Red to my palette, and I mix it with a sepia wash on the miniature. I'm trying to be chaotic and uneven, distributing more red to some places and leaving some of them without it. The trick here is to hold a plane you are painting horizontally, so the gravity won't work against you. I also added some green wash here and there. Generally this technique is called wet blending and usually you will use it to paint seamless transitions. But here I want to generate a disordered texture. When it was dry, I followed with a pure sepia ink. But every time I applied it to the surface, I dipped a brush in water and started mixing on the gate. I also used excess of ink to paint a walkway, just to check how this color works. And it doesn't, but I don't mind. Now, while waiting for a gate to dry, I decided to start working with stones. I will start with the darkest shade tone. In this case, I want to go with a violet, so it will contrast even more with an orange-yellow gate. I'm using Daler&Rowney's Payne's Grey, which is actually a very dark blue, and a ScaleColor Intensity Red. I simply mixed them in a pot, checking from time to time if the color is already a violet. I also added some ultra matte varnish from AK Interactive, cause I don't want a glossy look on my stones. I simply applied this mix all over the stones and ground. When I saw that a gate is dry, I applied some ultra matte varnish all over it. It dries quickly, so after I finished, I applied another layer with polyurethane matte varnish from Vallejo, which is way sturdier and more resilient after it dries. This quality will be super important in my later steps. There are still some parts that are not painted, and I want to block the colors for now to check the composition. I made a strong wash made of Liquitex black ink mixed 50-50 with water, with some addition of ultra matte varnish, and painted all over the concrete walls and the base. In the meantime, I worked a little bit with a walkway. I simply dry brushed it with green stuff wort Anthrax Metal mixed 1:1 with ScaleColor Abyssal Blue, cause I don't want it to be too shiny. I also wanted to move a little bit with stones. I dry brushed them 3 times, first with Citadel Mechanicus Standard Grey, second with Citadel Zamesi Desert, and third with Citadel Ushabti Bone. Then I washed it 3 times, not waiting between steps for washes to dry. First, I used Citadel Athonian Camoshade all over the stones. Second, Citadel Seraphim Sepia wash randomly on about 70% of areas. And third, Citadel Agrax Earthshade in recesses. Finally, I also added some Citadel Nuln oil onto the walkway grid. I'm using Citadel washes here only because I have them and I don't want them to go to waste. They are easy to use, yes, but in my opinion they are not really reliable. But in the messy work like this, it's actually a good trade. I thought it is a good occasion for me to use a dry pigment for the first time. I've decided to go with Vallejo Natural Umber. I simply took a brush and applied it in recesses of the rocks, on a still wet wash, so it will stick nicely. When it dried, I wasn't satisfied, so I corrected it with quick Citadel Dawnstone dry brush and a wash of Citadel Seraphim Sepia over the pigment. Okay, let's get back to the gate. I want to achieve an old peeling paint effect over the rusty metal, so I am going to paint all over the gate now. I'm using 2 layers of ScaleColor Abyssal Blue diluted with tiny bit of water. I want some parts to be yellow, so I'm painting over them with Kimera Colors Cold Yellow. So I mixed some yellow oxide and painted additional 2 layers. Now is a time for a fun part. I started scratching the surface with sharp tools. A plastic one, a scalpel, a sturdy brush, and some more random stuff. They all created different shapes and effects. Later on, I also experimented by painting over the area with a wash and then scraping again, with better results. But sadly, I don't have a footage of this step. This technique is possible thanks to strong varnishes below the layer of grey paint. There were also some happy accidents, where I peeled all the paint from the plastic, but I used them as a physical texture and painted inside of those areas with different dark colors. Lastly, I followed with 2 subsequent washes made from mixes of sepia and red ink, with a lot of water and some ultra matte varnish. Do you remember how I painted rust on a gate? I simply did the same thing with the concrete wall, but this time stamping with different shades of grey, pure, or mixed with a tiny bit of green, or beige. In the meantime, I painted the lamp and washed all the areas with diluted Liquitex black ink with an addition of some ultra matte varnish. I also mixed some Liquitex sub-green ink into the mix in the lower parts of the wall to add some visual interest. I felt a final touch is needed for this diorama to look a little more science fiction. I bought those tiny mushrooms on AliExpress a long time ago, and I felt this is their time to shine. Literally. I painted them with 5 or 4 layers of blue and white mixes, making sure that caps will be the brightest. I also decided that I will place them in the deepest crevices, so I dry brushed the same blue tones around the rocks. I made sure not to use the brightest tone of the shrooms, because I would destroy the effect. I glued them in place with superglue and made some corrections in the OSL. This is my simple Fallout style diorama made from scavenged waste I found all around the place. I experimented a lot, but the biggest discovery I made was that apart from a number of negate and mushrooms, I didn't need to use a precise brush at all. And the most useful brush here was one with the badly split tip. Now when this project is over, I have to politely wait for the COVID to let us participate in conventions. I already want to paint Mirko and Brego, listen to workshops of Krzysiek Kowalczyk, Michał Pisarski, Natalia Oracz and Katarzyna Kachagórska. And I'll definitely make a video once that happens. Also, if you're interested, I listed all the paints I used in the description of this video. With that being said, thanks for watching and see you next time.